Hello, bonjour and welcome to your new Bonheur Private Wines video. Here is my question for you today. Do you take tasting notes about the wines that you get to try, to remember them? If you don't, maybe you might want to consider starting maybe a little tasting note booklet, or you can just simply write a few notes on an app on your smartphone. If you already do, as a wine writer myself, I might have a few useful tips for you here. Why wouldn't you want to write tasting notes about your vinos? There are actually 1,000 reasons to do so. First of all, it helps you remember what you've tasted before while visiting a winery cellar door, for example, so you know what to order from them when you get back home. Well, I guess these days we don't get to visit wineries all that much, unfortunately, but maybe it's more about remembering which wines you really enjoyed from the Bonheur Private Wine selection, so you can order more when we make more available to you. By taking notes, over time you can also more easily identify the styles of wines that you enjoy more. In addition, you can track how wines evolve as they age in your cellar, because you can read yourself and track how you've tasted the wines over time. Maybe you want to start a wine blog. I did that 6 years ago and look where I am now. As I said, there's 1,000 good reasons to spend, if only a few minutes, writing down some impressions as you taste your vinos. So here are my few tips on how to get started and or how to do it better. Let's go. My fellow wine-loving friends, Julian here. Before we get started with the video, there is something that you have to know about. This video was made possible by the Bonheur Private Wine Partnership, and the reason I work with them is not just because it's been called the most unique wine club in America, but because they truly love the wines that they choose for you. Founded by Will Bonheur, the partnership is a small group of wine lovers who have come together to import excellent small batch wines that might otherwise get completely overlooked by large importers. They get them. Right now you can get your hands on 3 rare extreme altitude red wines from Argentina, from some of the purest, highest vineyards in the entire world, way up in the Andes Mountains. No middlemen, no additive packed supermarket wines here, no inflated cost. Plus you'll get exclusive access to more wine education videos from me, just like the one you're about to watch, to make sure you become an educated wine connoisseur. So make sure to check out the link in the video description to see if you want to become partner in something truly special in the world of wine. But for now, back to your video. A little while back, I made a video on this very channel about the 3 steps to tasting wine properly. I'll have a link in the video description if you want to get back to it and watch it. But as a quick TLDR, this essentially those 3 important phases to examine and describe a wine. Number 1, of course, its aspect, what we call its appearance. The color, of course, the hues, is it hazy, is it shiny, pale, deep, fizzy, etc. Remember to write a little something about this on your notes. Short is perfectly fine here, but it certainly helps remembering what the wine looked like. Quick impressions is what we need. Look, this rosé, you do want to describe it as a slightly pale salmon color, for example. It'll help you a whole lot understanding and remembering what this wine was all about when you read those notes later. Number 2, of course, you want to take a little time to sniff and smell your wine. Yes, of course. This prepares you mentally for the type of wine you're going to have, so there's no bad surprises when you sip it. You already know and expect a little better what it's going to taste like because you've smelled it before really well. As I always say, think of why you'd sniff a flower. It might seem completely pointless to some, but it's actually very enjoyable for who knows how to appreciate a pleasing bouquet. Same for wine. Anyhow, when you take notes about the smell of a wine that we call the nose, I wouldn't necessarily go too crazy or too long with a lengthy list of aromas. No one really wants to read a long directory of descriptors. Past 2 or 3, maybe 4 or 5 if you are creative, it really becomes a little meaningless if you ask me. If it goes too diverse, you kind of lose the point of trying to summarize a wine to its essential aromas. Even if you write notes for yourself for later, if you write too many notes here on what it smells like, you'll probably find later that you even yourself actually can't figure out what the wine really tasted like or smelled like when you read yourself again in a month or two, let alone in a year or two. So I'd say keep it tight and essential here. Plus, writing notes shouldn't distract you too much from the point of tasting wine, which is of course enjoying yourself. So no need to spend too much time on the nose. Feel the wine, smell the wine, enjoy it and write it down. Just a few aromas and or impressions. That's all we need. Once this is done, move on to the most important step of tasting wine and writing about it. Of course, this is the palate, describing how it tastes. You're following so far? I'm sure you are. 3 steps to tasting. The appearance, the looks are important, right? The smell, write a little short something about those, and now the taste. To guide you through fully documenting your tasting experience, subdivide this part into 3 little subparts: the flavors, the texture, and don't forget the finish. So number 1, the flavors. By those, I mean more what the wine reminds you of. Is it more about red berries, a bit of citrus, apple, apricot, coconut, coffee, whatever. This kind of flavors I mean here. Again, I'd say pick the dominant flavors mainly, at least initially, so you don't get too deep, too long, and too confused when writing them down. 2 or 3 main initial notes is great. You can always elaborate and get back to it a little later if the wine deserves it, but keep it short initially. Then make sure to think about having a little note about the texture of the wine and how it feels on your palate. Is it very acidic and sour? Is it sweet? Does it have harsh tannins or rather silky and smooth ones? Think about how oily the wine is as well, how mouth-filling it is when you taste it. Of course, there's some vocabulary that you can use, and I don't really have time, unfortunately, to elaborate much on this and give you all the possible vocabulary. I'll do it in other videos perhaps, but if you watch me, you've probably picked up on a few terms that I and other wine professionals use often. But regardless of the academic vocabulary or the jargon, what really matters is what you feel. So simply write this down. Just think about the texture is my point here. And then element number 3, another important aspect that you don't want to disregard. Very important, both from a hedonistic standpoint to better enjoy your wine, but also to write about it better. And that's our subpart number 3 of the taste that we call the finish. What the wine tells you what it tastes like after you've swallowed it or spit it out. It's actually at that point often that you really get to understand a wine. That's when it becomes really harsh and unpleasant. If it's a bad wine, that's when you really find out. That's when it falls short. If it's a pleasant but simple wine, it just disappears quickly, just shuts the door, runs away as soon as you've swallowed it. That's what a simple wine does, and so that's when you find out. But that's also when sometimes the 5% magic really happens if you do happen to have a great wine. That's when you realize it. It lasts, it reveals itself to you, you get to enjoy more layers and more components that you had not necessarily perceived earlier. That's when you really feel if you like and enjoy a wine. The first impression is crucial, but so is the last one as well. So pay attention there and of course write all of this down. Although to be perfectly honest with you, I should add here, and to really bring you more value with this video, that a trick that I use in my notes that you may have noticed if you watch me sometimes is not only to describe the individual flavors and aromas of a wine, the red berries, the citrus, the vanilla, the whatever, but also after smelling and tasting your vino, I advise to take a step back a little and think about what the wine makes you think about as a whole. If you watched my video about your Mediterranean wine selection that you would have just received, you might remember me saying for one of the wines, this one in particular, that I was saying that it almost exactly tasted like what a cherry juice would taste like, because it had a lot of cherry aromas, and it also tasted so juicy, a little biting, a little acidic, yet ripe and quite generous, just like a cherry juice. It wasn't the case in this particular wine, but if a wine reminds you of something but also has other flavors, completely different flavors, you could always say it tastes like a cherry juice, which gives you the frame, but to which a drop of vanilla essence would have been added to, or you can say a cherry juice infused with a bit of clove, a bit of cinnamon and orange peel. You add the different components, but you have the general image on hand. For another wine in the Mediterranean selection, this particular wine, a white wine, you may remember that I said that it tasted like an excellent lime and grapefruit mojito cocktail, because it had all of these intense citrus flavors, but it was also a bit minty, slightly vegetal and spicy, just like a mojito. I find that using those descriptive images and making those comparisons or metaphors is a great way to lift up tasting notes. If you write for someone, a magazine, a blog, or even for friends or yourself, it makes it more entertaining and self-explanatory to explain what the wines taste like with a few simple words, a simple image. Even if it's just for yourself, when you read your notes again someday about this wine in the future, you'll instantly remember what you thought about the wine that way, because you've created this image yourself, so you'll understand it when you read it again. And you can easily compare what the wine tastes like now to what it tasted before as you wrote it down. That's probably my best tip for writing better tasting notes about a wine. Use images, metaphors. And overall, for a practical example, here's what a solid yet not too long note, at least for me, should or could look like with what I wrote about this particular Italian wines that you've had in your Mediterranean selection from us. What I wrote is, this wine really looks lively with a shiny red color. It also shines through the nose with vibrant fruity notes of fresh sour cherry and blueberry, spicy tones of white pepper and peppermint, undertones of earthiness like forest floor, herbal scents of fennel. I love its explosive flavors of fresh acidic cherry. It somewhat tastes like a cherry juice would. Never had a cherry juice before, but it feels like we're getting an opportunity here with this very wine to taste it. Tannins are grippy and lively, somewhat like biting in a green apple, with a zingy crystal-like acidity. Flavors are all about the freshness of berries characters, just underlined delicately and cleverly by notes of freshly cut aromatic herbs, basil, oregano, thyme. Delightful. Does this describe a wine to you well, or at least give you an image of what it may taste like, even if you haven't tried it yourself? That's the wonder of tasting notes. You can communicate, talk to others, talk to yourself in the future, just writing a few notes like this. And so there you have it. Those were my top tips to write about wine, if only a little better. Overall, you have 5 points to think about: aspect, smell, flavors, texture and finish, and that's really all you need. And again, I wouldn't overcomplicate it, although that's very personal. I like things to be relatively simple, but some people might like to elaborate and be more parabolic in their writing, and that's fine too. These points that I gave you here are just a frame to work with, just methodical steps that I recommend you think about writing about. But of course, feel free to elaborate, articulate, expand and diverge as much as you'd like. That's also the beauty of writing about wine, or anything really. Throwing thoughts on paper, document, express, feel and share. There are also some apps on smartphones that allow you to keep digital records of those for yourself or for sharing with others, the wine community. Often you can also scan the label, take a picture, scan a label, and it'll match it, it'll identify automatically for you, so you don't have to enter all of this information, especially when it's in Greek, about the region or the grapes. I used to work for an app called Vivino at some point, probably the #1 wine app in the world, so they do that really well. I also worked with an app and a website that's called Wine Searcher, and they have an app for this as well, the Cellar Tracker, and there are a few more. The important point, have fun with it, share with the community if you feel like it, keep it for yourself, but the most important part is to enjoy yourself while you're writing down, and I think it helps enjoying the wine a little bit better. My final word on tasting notes, just know who you're writing for and try to please them, especially if this is yourself. Next week, as a complement to this video, we'll talk about scoring wine and why, if you write tasting notes, you should probably start scoring wines as well. Give them a score, a grade. It's actually very useful. We'll talk about how critics score wines too in magazines and publications, but enough for today. Thanks for watching, and I will see you soon in the wonderful world of wine. Cheers. Bye bye. Au revoir.